Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Rosenthal. I'm a bencher with the Law Society and a criminal defense lawyer. It's my privilege to welcome you today and bring greetings on behalf of the Treasurer of the Law Society, Paul Shavis. Thank you for joining us for Improving Health, Improving Service, Well-Being in the Legal Profession, and Access to Justice. This is Access to Justice Week event is organized by the Action Group on Access to Justice, also known as TAG, the Canadian Institute for the Administration of Justice, and the Law Society's Equity Department. I would like to begin by recognizing that we're here together in Toronto, which is a Mohawk word that means where there are trees standing in the water. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. I also acknowledge the Haudenosaunee and would like to recognize the long history of all First Nations in Ontario and the Métis and Inuit people. We thank the First Nations people who've lived and live in these lands for sharing them with us in peace. Recent studies, such as the one we'll hear about today, indicate that legal professionals are at a higher risk for anxiety, substance abuse, and depression than those in the general population. Results from the Canadian Bar Association survey found that stress, burnout, and anxiety were issues perceived as the most prevalent in the legal profession. This is a critical issue for the legal profession and for the public who rely on lawyers to manage their everyday legal problems. Addressing mental health is an ongoing priority for the Law Society. Last year, our Mental Health Task Force approved a strategy to address mental health and addiction issues through both preventative and regulatory approaches. The strategy focuses on new areas where the regulator can make a difference. It also emphasizes increasing awareness of valuable but often underused existing resources, such as the Member Assistance Program, or MAP. MAP provides services and support to lawyers, paralegals, law students, judges, and other professionals and their families. Events like this one are critical to advancing meaningful change and dialogue about how shifts in the legal profession culture will benefit lawyers while also enhancing access to justice for the public. It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speakers, Ronit, Dinovitzer, and Jonathan Koltai. They will be speaking about findings from their recent study, The Status Health Paradox, Organizational Context, Stressed Exposure and Well-Being in the Legal Profession. Ronit is a professor of sociology at the University of Toronto, where she is cross-appointed to the Institute of Management and Innovation. She is also a faculty fellow at the American Bar Foundation in Chicago, where she is co-director of the Research Group on Legal Diversity and affiliated faculty in Harvard's program on the legal profession. Jonathan is a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto. His dissertation research examines the ways that organizational contexts shape the health and emotional lives of individuals and how job conditions influence worker well-being over time. Please join me in welcoming Ronit and Jonathan.
Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation today. What we're going to do today is give you a little sociological insight into the legal profession from our vantage point as non-lawyers. What we want to do is start off, well, and hope that my thing is not working. There we go. So patterns of mental health distress, substance abuse or dissatisfaction are topics that are much loved by the media. Headlines abound, jokes abound. A recent high-profile story in the New York Times focused in particular on substance abuse. Our job today, is not to compare the status or mental health outcomes of lawyers compared to others in the population. But I did want to begin by offering just a few little points because the media attention on lawyer dissatisfaction or lawyer mental health and well-being might lead you to think that lawyers are perhaps the most distressed of all occupations. And so I draw very quickly on data from the United States offered by the CDC, which surveys individuals across the United States quite often, and you can see in yellow how lawyers fare compared to others. So while it's not the focus of what we're doing today, you see that lawyers are not the head of the pack in terms of what's called unhealthy days. Worse off are individuals in occupations in art and design or in protective services. Rates of suicide, equally, lawyers fare perhaps worse than individuals in healthcare support, but rates of suicide are lower than individuals in architecture and engineering, for example. So again, that is not our goal for today, but I find it's always helpful to put this into some kind of social context. But what we want to do today is draw in particular on two studies that I've been working on in particular for a long time. One of them is called After the JD. It's a national study of lawyers in the United States. That means we surveyed lawyers from across the United States who were admitted to the bar in the year 2000, and we followed them for over 13 years. These lawyers are representative of the group of lawyers who were admitted to practice in the year 2000. While we surveyed them at 3 points in time, today what we're going to do is focus on results of the lawyers, what's called Wave 2. Those are lawyers who had been working for about 7 or 8 years. We also are lucky enough to have unique data that I collected in large, funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. That study is called the Law and Beyond Study. The Law and Beyond Study surveyed the entire population of eligible lawyers who were called to the bar in 2010 across Canada. About close to 50% of the lawyers I surveyed responded. And the survey was run in 2012, so the lawyers in the Canadian portion of our results have been in practice for about 2 years. So what we're going to do today is draw on both of these sets of data to provide an in-depth understanding of the distribution of well-being in the Canadian and American legal professions. And our goal today is to draw on sociology to help explain that distribution. And what we do here is draw on a long tradition of sociology that explains that there is a deep stratification in the legal profession, an organization that helps us understand that the legal profession is not a unified profession. Back in the 1980s, there was a very famous study called the Chicago Lawyer Study. What they found in the Chicago Lawyer Study was something called the two hemispheres of the legal profession. The dividing line of those two hemispheres was the type of client you served. On one hand were the lawyers who served individual clients. On the other hand were lawyers who served corporate clients. That dividing line was connected to a whole range of other characteristics that will end up being important today. Those characteristics include the law school you graduated from, your ethnic and religious background. On one side of the divide, lawyers who serve individuals tend to come from what they found were less elite institutions. They were members of ethnic or religious minorities. The lawyers who serve corporations, on the other hand, tended to come from higher status law schools. They tended to be white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Now that two hemisphere study was quite stark. That finding was stark. What we find in the more modern legal profession is something we call a step-graded distribution of inequality. So what I have here are two images. On the bottom are law school tiers. So in the United States, law schools are ranked every year by U.S. News and World Report. So you see top 10, top 20, down to the 4th tier. And what you find is graduates of the most elite law schools end up working, these are their first jobs, work in the largest law firms, and the proportion of elite graduates working in large law firms declines as law school tier declines. This panel here shows the Canadian data, which is less stark than the American data, but again, you continue to see a pattern that relates prestige to outcomes. So this is just in terms of where you work. We also find such outcomes relating to things such as job satisfaction. So based on the American data, what I did in this graph is give you a snapshot. At the bottom, we have law school tier. This is only individuals who are working in large law firms. And this is a finding that we discovered early on in our study, and that has motivated a lot of what we're going to show you today. Because what you find, the blue lines, you see the blue bars are declining. The blue bars are the proportion of individuals working in large law firms who say they're going to leave their job within 2 years. Elite law graduates are more likely to say they are leaving their job within 2 years. Tier 4 graduates are less likely to say that. In contrast, the green is how satisfied are you with your decision to become a lawyer. Elite law graduates, least satisfied. Non-elite law graduates, most satisfied. So you can see that there's a distribution of something going on here that tracks where you went to law school, where you work, and it links up with your satisfaction. And of course, the irony in all this is your earnings, which are fundamentally structured by where you work. And so the lawyers who were reporting the least satisfaction and the highest mobility intentions were the lawyers working in the largest firms, and those lawyers, of course, are the lawyers earning the most. And so the question is, what does all this have to do with our understanding of well-being? And so what we're going to do today is take this initial insight of inequality and stratification in the legal profession that is undergirded by a stratification across where lawyers work and what they earn to help us understand the distribution of well-being among lawyers. So I'm going to turn it over to John.
Should I sit or sit? I don't know. I'll sit for now. See what it feels like. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming. My name is John Koltai. Just to give you some context, my research generally looks at the connections between social inequality on the one hand and health and well-being on the other hand in the population. So one of the main aims of this line of work is to look at the ways that social patterns in health or mental health in the population or within a given subgroup map onto patterns in income or education levels within that subgroup. And we also want to explain why those patterns exist. One of the most influential perspectives in this area is that forms of stratification lead to differential levels of stress exposure, and that this uneven distribution of stressors in a given population or subgroup also explains well-being differences, whether that's physical health or emotional well-being. So a big question in this area is this: does higher status attainment always benefit health? And so on average, yes, definitely it does. We know one of the most consistent findings from decades of this sort of research is that people located higher on the status spectrum, whether that's measured by education, income, or occupational prestige, these people tend to enjoy much better health outcomes, mental health outcomes, and they also tend to live longer, by the way. But there are pockets of complexity in this overall relationship. And one of the caveats is that the association between certain markers of status and health, or mental health, are not uniform across all contexts. And second, the health effects of higher status attainment likely depend on the arrangements and the circumstances that are structured into people's social roles, so the work role, for example. So in this study, we focused in particular on research that has shown that workers with more income and education and occupational status tend to experience certain chronic stressors to a disproportionate extent. These often involve time demands, like high levels of job pressure and overwork or long work hours, or conflicts between work and the responsibilities that people have in their other social roles and other life domains. It's important to note that when we zoom out in the population, or if we're looking at the general workforce, these stressors don't translate into worse health outcomes for higher status individuals, because people at the lower end of the status spectrum in the population still face a greater cumulative amount of life stress. But we were interested in what might happen if we zoom into this specific subgroup for which these stressors are apparently kind of the norm. So here are the more specific study questions in the study that we're presenting today. First, does higher status attainment filter individuals into more stressful role conditions? And second, do these stressful role conditions reverse the health benefits of higher social standing that we typically observe in those studies that I mentioned earlier? So I'll actually begin with question 2 here. Recall from that graph earlier showing the income distribution across practice settings. We basically wanted to know what are the average levels, for example, of depressive symptoms across practice settings that also have different average levels of income, right? And I'm just going to show you what's going on in the Canadian data, but definitely note that in the American data, the dispersion is much greater. And so I think on average, it was about $70,000 2 years out of law school was the average in the public sector, and it was a little over 100,000 2 years after law school in the large private firms. That gap was about $100,000 more in the United States, or not $100,000 more. It was about, on average, it was $80,000 in the public sector and $180,000 in the large law firms. And I'll just note that the patterns that I'm going to show you and talk about are essentially the same in both data sets.
Is it not forwarding?
Oh, okay. Oops. There we go. So these are some of the main findings in our study. We found that lawyers in the private sector, including those in larger firms, experience higher levels of depressive symptoms or reported higher levels of depressive symptoms relative to those in the public sector. So even though lawyers in the private sector make more money, particularly those in large firms, they appear to be at a mental health disadvantage. This goes against the grain of some of the patterns I mentioned earlier, and it's something we call a status health paradox. As I mentioned earlier, one of the main goals of this research is to discover these sort of social patterns, but then we want to explain, in this case statistically, why they exist. So one of the great things about these data is that they include some very good measures of stress exposure. We focused on two sources of chronic stress that are particularly important in the legal profession. Long work hours and work-life conflict is what we call it. In this study, respondents were coded as having extremely long work hours or overwork if they worked 60 or more hours a week. And for the work-life conflict measure, respondents were asked about how often their job interferes with their home or their family life, and how often their job interferes with their social or leisure activities. And so several studies have linked this type of work-life interference with lower levels of job satisfaction, not just in the legal profession, in the workforce in general. Lower levels of life satisfaction, increased likelihood of intentions to leave organizations, so quit intentions, and also higher levels of psychological distress. So we know that this type of interference is a fairly common issue for lawyers, but we suspected that it was not evenly distributed across these practice settings based on what we know about how these settings are structured and organized. So here's a graph. It has the percentage of those working 60 or more hours a week on the y-axis, the vertical axis, and then practice settings on the x, the horizontal. So as you can see, on average, much more lawyers in the private sector are much more likely to report long hours, and specifically, about 17% of those working in the public sector report that they work more than 60 hours a week, and whereas about 48% of lawyers in large private firms report working those sort of hours. And then the other firm types are somewhere in the middle. So this is work-life conflict by practice setting. So here you see similar patterns for work-life conflict. We observed the lowest average levels of this sort of interference in the public sector, and we see a fairly dramatic rise within the private sector, and within the private sector, that rises according to firm size. Lastly, these are the patterns for work-life conflict across the income distribution. So in our analysis, we split income up into quintiles, so fifths. And as you can see, with each step up the income ladder, work-life conflict also increases. So we found in our regression models that even after controlling for a wide range of demographic characteristics about these lawyers across both contexts, overwork or long work hours and work-life conflict were associated positively with depressive symptoms. So when we included overwork and work-life conflict in our statistical models, we were able to explain sector and firm size differences in depressive symptoms across sector and firm sizes. Basically, what this suggests is that the stress exposure that these people are experiencing is one of the main culprits for the uneven experiences of emotional well-being across practice settings. So just to sum up those findings quickly, lawyers in the private sector and in progressively larger firms experience the highest levels of overwork and work-life conflict. Long hours or overwork, I'm sorry, I'm using that interchangeably. Long hours and work-life conflict are associated positively and significantly with depressive symptoms. And when our models adjust for those forms of stress, especially work-life conflict, we explain the differences in depression across practice settings. Oops, I didn't have that. So I'll end off quickly before I leave it to Ronit. So I think one of the main takeaways here is that if you're serious about trying to alleviate mental health disparities in the legal profession, it's probably not enough to tell people that they should go meditate more or do more yoga. And don't get me wrong, those things are great, and I do them myself, and I think they're very beneficial. But the problem here doesn't really start with health behaviors at the individual level, right? It has sources in the way work is organized from the top down, and in the organizational climates that require, or at least glorify, extreme work hours, and in those environments that provide very little opportunity for workers to balance responsibilities in competing life domains. So I'll hand it off now to Ronit for something about implications.
Sure. Well, do you mind if I want to recap just to bring home the findings a little bit? Because what we did was we not only showed that there is this distribution of work-life conflict and stress exposure by where you work, but the point was that we were able to construct statistical models that showed us that it is these stress exposures that are the reason that lawyers in large firms report more depressive symptoms. Like as firm size increases, especially in comparison to the public sector, that the explanatory factor is stress exposure. So it's not the fact that, large law firms aren't a being that are irrelevant. It's what happens in those firms, is what John was saying. It is the stress exposure that goes on in private law firms that is the culprit and at the root of the health disadvantage that we find. Is that fair?
That's fair.
All right. Now, we are both sociologists, and our job was to try to find what the patterns are and what the mechanisms are to explain these patterns. We are a little bit less well-placed to answer the question of what will be done personally, but we did, we feel it's a little bit too provocative to stand here and say, work hours, overwork, and work-life conflict are at the root of what's going on without offering at least some resources that we've read about in the literature about what other people are finding that might help. Again, the sources that we're pointing to are organizationally based resources. They're not about the yoga and the meditation. They're about addressing the organizational underpinnings. I've been studying lawyers for a long time, and lawyers always say, well, but it's about your relationship with the client. What else can you do? And so we found the work of Leslie Perlow. Leslie Perlow studied management consultants, BCG in particular, very high level, high demand, client-centered professionals. And what they did in this experiment, and she did a series of interventions with consultants in particular, and what she did was that they forced the consultants to take time off. Forced them. They said, 1 day a week you will not answer your phone. I was about to say BlackBerry, it's like 10 years ago, sorry. You will not look at your phone. Your client knows about this, that we're running this experiment. You will not answer your phone for one night. You will also be forced to take 1 day off a week. So at first, the consultants rebelled. They said, there's no way, our client will never hire us back. We're going to do terrible work. But everyone agreed to go through with this experiment. And ultimately, and they also agreed to suspend the experiment if the client said, I hate this. All right, so they went through with it. The client didn't say, I hate this. And at the end of the day, what this chart shows is that job satisfaction among the consultants increased. And at the end of the day, their value on delivery for the red bars are the teams that did this forced time off experiment. The outcomes were in general better for them. So what she found was that there are a few features of these kinds of forced time off experiments that are critical. And again, I'm paraphrasing and borrowing from her work here. And some of them include that it's forced, that it's these time off mechanisms have to be planned in advance.
Predictable.
right? They're not on the fly. They're not like, today I'm off. When you begin the project, these are scheduled. The second thing that she discussed was that you have to have conversations about this time off at all your project meetings to check in with people, how are they doing? And a third one, which is quite obvious, is that you need your superiors, your higher ups to buy into this, right? Everyone needs to be on the same page. Of course, if you're working particularly in a more hierarchical environment, you need to have the partners sign off, right? Because your associates can't be taking this time off if the partners aren't signed off on it. She has more detail in her work, but we just felt this experiment was close enough in kind to a profession akin to the kinds of stressors that we're discussing, and that might be of interest to individuals thinking about what kind of interventions might work. And of course, the question is, why might you care at all? Of course, this is Access to Justice Mental Health Week, so you're here because you buy in to this, probably. But the idea here is if you don't have your legal representation healthy, how good is your representation going to be? And of course, on the other hand, there's been a strong business case made, particularly focused on the large law firm. There's a long and broad literature and debate about large law firm and turnover in the large law firm. Joan Williams, on one hand, is making an argument that there's a lot of new competitors popping up in the market that are focused on stealing the talent that the large law firm is trying to hire. And if the large law firm in particular doesn't address the issues of work-life balance and well-being that its young associates are demanding, that they might lose the talent they're seeking to retain, right? Again, we know on the one hand that the large law firm needs attrition amongst its associates. Not everyone can make partner. On the other hand, the turnover rates are costly. And so there is a business case to be made about trying to keep the associates you want to keep on long-term by addressing it head-on. Again, by taking on some of the measures that others have found to be helpful. Do you want to add anything?
No, I think you did quite well there.
Thank you. So we're going to stop there, and we're happy to take whatever questions you have. I think someone's moderating.
So because we're webcasting, I'll ask that if you do have questions in person, is this where I'm supposed to be? Yes. If you do have questions, you can go to the microphone. And we are also taking questions from our online attendees. And if you go to the appropriate place on the page, you will be able to find it. So we had a question over here, and I'll just ask, sir, if you can go to the microphone.
Thanks. I had a couple of questions. I noticed the farmers and the fishermen don't have much stress, but they also seem to commit suicide the most.
I wouldn't say that farmers and fishermen don't have much stress. They actually experience quite a bit of financial hardships, especially in the current economy.
They were on the low side of your graph.
Data.
And then for suicide, they were way at the other end.
For stress?
Did I read that wrong?
It was unhealthy days. Let me get back there.
That was like the first graph.
It was.
Yeah, I don't know. That's not our research, so I can't really speak to that.
But I'll put it up just for, there we go.
Farming, fishing, low.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those are unhealthy.
Suicide.
These are unhealthy days, not stress.
So that's unhealthy.
But it's a composite measure. Again, this is not our particular research, so
Okay.
I leave it to the epidemiologist to help us understand that one.
Okay.
But
Sorry.
data from the CDC.
I have two other questions. One, geographic distribution. Did you study, was there a difference between Toronto big firms and Nova Scotia big firms, for example?
So our measure of big firms is 100 plus, so probably not Nova Scotia. We did not examine, is region in the model?
I'd have to go back and check that. I know in our robustness checks, we definitely controlled for region to make sure that wasn't a competing factor. I can't remember if in our final statistical models.
Yeah, I can tell you on other measures in other parts of the study that I've looked at, you do find obviously regional distributions in earnings. but I have not found, for example, on other questions of interest, much to do with.
I'm just wondering if there's less stress on Vancouver Island than there is on Bay Street,
But it's a great question.
And finally, is there a case to be made, therefore, to break up the big firms?
Well, that is someone else's question to answer, but all we can say is if the big firm wants to retain the associates it hopes to retain, it might want to think about some of these questions.
Other questions, comments? Well, while people think about it, let me say a bit about how this relates to what we're trying to do today. My name is David Wright. I am the chair of the Law Society Tribunal, and but I'm here actually as the coordinator of the Canadian Institute for the Administration of Justice Ethics Program. And over the last several years, we at the CIAJ, which is an organization that brings together tribunal members, judges, academics, practicing lawyers, court staff. The goal is to bring people in the justice system together. And we've been partnering with TAG over the last few years for our ethics program. And the last few years we've focused on mental health among clients in the justice system and mental health among justice system professionals. And so this year we wanted to build on some of the work we've done other years by talking about how mental health issues play throughout a lawyer or a paralegal's career, and we're going to hear shortly from students, and how the mental health of lawyers, paralegals, and others affects the services that are offered to clients and to participants in the justice system. How perhaps better, more healthy lawyers and paralegals can lead to more access to justice. I'm wondering if you think that there are results from your research that would assist us in convince. I appreciate that you're saying there have to be systemic changes, but at the same time, do you think there's education around the fact, particularly from the study of consultants, are there ways that we can help convince, if we should, legal professionals that spending less time at work might help deliver better service to their clients? And is that something we should try to convince people of?
Well, I do think that sounds like a laudable goal. Certainly, Leslie Perlow's work emphasized the way talking about this is critical, that if everyone's on the same page, that the stressors of work are undermining your productivity. And if we're all on the same page, that allows also you to take the time off that you might need. So extrapolating from her work, that sounds like a laudable, like a reasonable thing to be thinking about.
And there is lots out there in the kind of work stress specific literature that does show that things like burnout and job-related strain are related to lower levels of productivity and also work engagement. So I think there is a case to be made there that attending to these things wouldn't necessarily hurt, at least.
And of course, I assume that people who want to leave their jobs, which you found pretty high, means less continuity in those workplaces.
The rates of turnover are very high.
Yeah. So I want to introduce Sabrina Dallin, who really has coordinated this, is the coordinator of TAG, and has helped put together the program, and also has some questions from the web, I think.
I do. I've got 2 webcast questions. So thanks so much, Ronit and Jonathan. That was such a great presentation. And it's my personal passion to bring more sociology into access to justice conversations. So that's fantastic. So 2 webcast questions for you. One is, did you find any variation in terms of practice area? And did you find anything significant in terms of gender?
Okay. I don't have an answer in terms of field of practice, but I can tell you what we all know is the correlation. Chicago Lawyers was the first to do this, and this is how they discovered the 2 hemispheres, was the tight nature between the fields in which you practice and where you're practicing. So now, if you're going to start looking within the large law firm at who's doing, tax work versus commercial real estate, I don't have an answer to that, but we do know that the distribution. So I don't have a direct answer. At the macro level, yes, field of practice relates to where you work, but at the internal within firm level, I don't know. But again, that's definitely interesting.
And for gender, in our models, gender, we tested what we call statistical interactions, and we tested whether or not the effect of practice setting was different for men and women on things like depression and health, and we didn't find any significant differences there. On its own, gender was significant in the models, so females did report higher levels of psychological distress relative to males. That is consistent with what we've seen in the research, in the population and in the workforce. Yeah.
So what we found was that women are reporting higher levels of distress, but it's not women in large firms or in the public sector. Those women are reporting similar levels, right? So it's not women in firms versus women in the public sector. It's just women versus men.
Yeah.
Hi. In professional regulation at the Law Society, we see a large number of people who have mental health issues. But my observation is that most of these individuals are, by and large, sole practitioners. We very rarely see lawyers from large firms. So I don't know if you've thought about this. Is it because large firms have a better social network system, or because the macho attitude in large law firms means that people don't report having mental health issues, or any observations or anything you can help us with there?
That's a fair question. Again, we can't answer it except to say, there's always questions of selection. There's also a long history of, even when you study disciplinary actions, large firm versus sole practitioner, you find patterns that, again, are the product of a lot of social processes, not necessarily, so I guess what I'm saying is it might be that individuals working in large firms are able to draw on other resources. These are larger organizations that have more HR, whereas a sole practitioner doesn't have an HR outreach office to reach out to, and will reach out hopefully directly to the Law Society. So that's my armchair guess.
Yeah, I can't really speak to the more professional stuff, but it's also important to note that these models are about average effects across practice settings, and that we're not saying that everyone in large firms are highly distressed and everyone in the public sector feels phenomenal all the time.
Thank you. That's an important point. Yeah.
Can I pick up on Sabrina's question and ask you a more general question, which is, part of why we wanted you here is to have lawyers and those studying them to talk to each other. Because we don't often hear from sociologists in these kind of conversations. And I guess my question is, how do you think that I know not everybody here is a legal professional, but those of us in the justice system can and should learn from your work in terms of putting things into practice? I know you've talked about sort of, days off and so on, but more generally, how do you think sociologists and legal professionals can speak to and learn, how we can learn from you, I guess, in particular?
That's a big question.
That's what I'm always here for.
So I teach a course on the legal profession to undergraduates. And I always tell them, they now know more. There is a massive literature that focuses on the legal profession. We look at things that range from job satisfaction to mental health outcomes to turnover to the retention of women. And I know the Law Society has reached out to academics to run a number of the studies that it's interested in. I think it's helpful for members of the legal profession to know that they're the subject of study and that there's a lot they can learn about their profession. I do think one of the things that's really important is that understanding the social underpinnings of a lot of this patterning is like a key takeaway. You need to understand how a lot of the social distribution of what's going on in the legal profession really comes from a systematic stratification of social inequality more generally. I think that's a really important finding that we don't think about a lot in our daily lives, and that those patterns relate to a whole bunch of outcomes of interest.
It's also about where you want to target interventions. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Keep
Okay.
going. We've got lots of time.
Okay.
So.
It's also about where we want to target interventions and whether or not you want to try to, fix something after it's broken or try to prevent, at its sources, what's creating those emotional differences or health differences in a profession. And if we're talking about things like interventions, then this sort of stuff is looking at things more at the organizational level that you can try to change rather than trying to tell people to do different health behaviors. Do you know what I mean? It's just directing your thinking a little bit more to the top-down sources.
So I just had a question about the sort of effects of work-life conflict and overwork. So those are both getting at like the duration of hours that you're working, and then from an associate perspective, like the predictability of those hours. I was just wondering if you noticed a difference both in effect size and in statistical significance for either of those two variables, and if one of them had a more profound impact on sort of stress than the other.
Oh, got a stats guy. Yeah, actually, generally. So the long hours variable, it was significant in our models when we entered. And we entered these variables sequentially. We progressively adjusted for them. So when we added long hours into the model, it was significantly related to depression, for example, and it explained a little bit of the firm size differences and sector differences in depression. But it was really when we adjusted for work-life conflict that we saw all those differences disappear. And when we adjusted for work-life conflict, the effect of overwork went away. So that suggests that overwork is leading to work-life conflict. That's one interpretation of it, is overwork is leading to work-life conflict, and work-life conflict is related to depression, and practice setting structures work-life conflict. And then when you adjust for all those things, you see those effect sizes disappear. That make sense? Okay.
Another one from the web.
I've got another webcast question for you. So this one asks about technology. So when you talked about the study where the management consultants were, I'm just extrapolating from the webcast question now, obviously, but when you talked about the management consultants and they had forced time off, how would you manage that in terms of the internet, right? Because people feel compelled to respond to the flashing light or the notification on their phone. And then the kind of next sub-question is legal professional culture really valorizes overwork, and the billable hour is the metric of stress, right? Because it's this many hours or whatever, and you want to demonstrate that, how many per week or how much earned or whatever. So a lot of what we're talking about in terms of dismantling are the very things that are created to show power, wealth, and prestige. So technology, and then legal professional culture, how to balance those two things, and what we are taught to value and respect is showing like power.
Well, I think at its heart, that's what that intervention was trying to target. I think management consultants were the exact same way. And so the rule was, I am not answering any emails tonight. Like, do not expect an answer, right? Because the people that she studied will always answer an email within the hour. Right? Same for the lawyer, maybe closer, under that, right? So the idea here was, that this person will not be responding tonight. In certain situations, they added more more people to the project in order to account for some of the time off. It depended on the experiment they were running. But you're correct, and this is what we're trying to say. This is, at its heart, something that is not just about individuals, but is about a larger organizational culture, so to speak, demands, expectations, and the billable hour. There used to be headlines that it's dying, but be interesting if anyone thinks it's dying, but probably not. And so that's 100% what needs to be addressed here.
And I would add that you're absolutely right, especially with these sort of professional group lawyers. Groups like BCG, Boston's Consulting Group, high-powered professionals, working long hours, extremely long hours, is seen as heroic and actually a badge of honor in a lot of circumstances, right? And so we're talking about or a lot of people talk about reducing or addressing at least mental health stigmas, right? But in some of that, to address that, you actually have to address stigmas surrounding more flexible work arrangements. Those are highly stigmatized in themselves, right? And so if somebody, if a mother, for example, needs to, have more flexible work arrangements in order to meet those competing life demands in work-life conflict, but she's afraid to take them because she feels that there's going to be a serious career penalty to that, that's stigmatization, right? And so if you're not comfortable asking for that or doing that, then you're not going to get to the sort of sources that we're talking about.
And let me add another intervention from another study that was published on data from a law firm. And what they did there was they studied individuals who took parental leave. And the experiment in that firm was that individuals were randomly assigned a mentor. And what they found was that individuals who had been randomly assigned a powerful mentor, an individual is powerful within the firm, those individuals who took parental leave were not penalized, actually did well when they returned to work, compared to individuals who were not randomly assigned a powerful mentor. So there's a lot of interesting tidbits out there to help us think about some of the ways in which you can manage stigma. So the attachment to a powerful mentor, that wasn't of your own doing, right? Because a lot of these things are initiated otherwise. So that I find that one of a really powerful example of thinking about how our typical work arrangements and assumptions can get disrupted.
I wonder if there are so you've looked at Canada and the US, and there's research here. Are the mental health issues that legal professionals are facing in North America the same as in the rest of the world, and are there these same kind of pressures?
Do you know general professions?
I haven't looked at the. No.
I have to guess the UK would be very similar.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know other contexts.
Yeah. Can't really speak to that with these data.
But if I had to hazard a guess, the UK would be in the same boat.
Yeah, of course. Do we have anything else on the web? All right. Well, Sabrina, I'm looking for a cue from you. Move on. Okay. Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate you bringing the sociological perspective into this. I think we need to, as I said, have more of these conversations together. And we look forward, I'd like to, I think you should run your legal professions course here at Osgoode Hall from a sociological perspective, and then we can start figuring out how to regulate in light of that. So thank you so much for taking the time to come and speak here at the Law
Thanks
Society.
for having us.
So we'll just pause very briefly while we ask our next panel to come up. So we want to move from hearing about the research to hearing about the lived experience of people who are beginning their journey as legal professionals, as students. And we're delighted that Yukimi Henry, who will introduce our students, who is the manager of wellness, academic and personal growth at the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Law, has agreed to put together this panel to think about what is happening in law schools and how that will work throughout people's professional lives. So Yukimi is has a training in both law and social work. She graduated at the U of T joint LLB MSW program in 2000. She worked as a criminal defense lawyer and then transitioned to social services, working in a number of areas, including homelessness services, at-risk youth, forensic mental health, and reproductive health. She also worked in post-conflict zone legal services development. She's had a psychotherapy practice, and since 2016, she's been at the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto, working in particular on these issues. So we're hoping that through her and the students, we can now tie in some of this to how we build our careers. So thank you all very much for joining us, and Yukimi will introduce the students.
Absolutely. How's the audio? Okay? All right. So thank you very much, both to Sabrina and David and the Law Society, for having us here and incorporating us into this conversation. The way I think the four of us conceptualize this working together with the research that's been presented is to, one, increase the narrative or the portrait of what mental health implications look like within the practice of law by including the voices of people who are engaged in legal education now. These are our future managing partners. These are our future benchers. It is, these voices that are going to hopefully be driving the kind of systemic shift that I think we're all hoping for vis-a-vis the kind of adverse mental health outcomes that have been presented in some of this research. So bringing them into this conversation, I think, is absolutely critical. The other thing that I think this conversation kind of does, as is sort of implied by what I just said, is that this is, the research indicates what is. This conversation hopefully can be what can be. By virtue of the positions that these students have in terms of the agents of change and, quite frankly, the beneficiaries of change, I think hearing more about how they currently experience mental health within a legal education framework, but also how they're constructively engaging with those adverse outcomes, I think make potentially some opportunities or for constructive engagement within the profession as a whole. And I think that the students will speak to how they can potentially foresee translating the skills they're developing now in terms of managing mental health, both in an individual and on a more structural kind of level, into legal practice. So we have some ways of hopefully kind of eliciting that information and guiding the conversation in that direction. Before introducing our three wonderful panelists from different Ontario law schools, I'm going to give a really, really brief introduction to sort of mental health within the post-secondary context here, so we have a bit of a framework for what it is they're going to be talking about. So across the broader landscape of post-secondary institutions, we've seen a really staggering increase in the numbers of students seeking support for mental health issues in the form of counseling supports, psychiatric supports, and academic accommodations for mental health disabilities and experiences. In Canada, the universities, we see reporting increases in the range of 35% and upwards in terms of the increase over the last 5 years in students seeking these kinds of supports. At the University of Toronto, the Accessibility Services, the Central University department that provides accommodations, academic accommodations for students for a variety of disabilities, including mental health disabilities, they've seen increases of upwards of 20% per year over the course of the last 5 years. The American research is more robust in terms of tracking nationally post-secondary mental health, but we see some absolutely alarming statistics coming out of some of the research bodies in the U.S., including the American Colleges Health Association, which reports that in 2016, 38% of responding post-secondary students indicated they had experiences of depression so acute that it impaired their functioning. They had 10% of responding students indicate that they had seriously considered suicide within the last 12 months. So this is a context for what the broader landscape of mental health is looking like. And while we don't have the same statistics available specific to law students within the Canadian context, the information that's available by mental health professionals and administrators speaks to there being similarly dire need for further information and further intervention in terms of mental health outcomes. And this is precisely the kind of conversation that we're having here right now, which potentially serves to address some of those issues. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. We're joined by Amanda Hawkins, who is a second-year student from the Faculty of Law at Windsor. She is originally from Windsor, Essex County, and completed her Bachelor of Science at the University of Windsor. She's worked as a research assistant with Windsor Law's Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and she sits on the Mental Health Awareness Committee, as well as facilitating sexual assault prevention workshops at the law school. Next to her is Alex Evangelista, who is the president of Osgood's Legal and Literary Society, which is a main branch of student government up at Osgood Hall Law School. He's currently completing his 3L year and will begin articling in Toronto very soon. He has been involved in a number of initiatives and student groups on campus. In addition to his involvement with student government, he is also an executive of the Osgood's Peer Support Center and has been heavily involved in their Mooting Society. And last but not least, we're joined by David Ryback, who is a second-year student at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law. David grew up in just outside of Stony Plain, which is a small town of about 17,000 people in rural Alberta. Prior to law school, David graduated from the University of Alberta with a degree in economics and political science. While at U of A, David volunteered as a counselor with the Peer Support Center. And as the first member of his family to attend a post-secondary institution, David co-founded the University of Toronto's First Generation Students Network during his first year at law school. The purpose of that group being to reduce the social, economic, and professional barriers that law students who are the first in their family to attend a post-secondary institution face as they're beginning their legal careers. So with that, I'm going to pass off the conversation to each of them and then invite all of you to join the conversation with questions for them. Amanda, would you like to start?
Sure. I'll kind of go over for you a little bit of my personal experience, as well as some of the things that I've experienced generally in the law school as a whole, and then kind of how that relates back to everything we've talked about. So personally, I had a bit of a struggle with depression and anxiety in high school and my undergrad. So coming into law school, I was very aware of my own personal limits and then how my mental health is going to factor into being a student in the law school. I was very pleasantly surprised when I started Windsor Law with the amount of services and recognition there was when I started for making sure that you were mentally healthy and able to recognize things kind of before they become a severe problem. As she mentioned, I attend Windsor and I've lived in Windsor my entire life, so I have the benefit of living at home while I'm attending law school, which presents its own set of problems, as well as alleviating some of the stress that other people might feel living away from home. I've also worked during the 2 years that I've been at law school so far in part-time retail jobs as well as at the university. So that's some context as to some of the issues that have played into my mental health as I've attended law school. Some of the things that I see as issues for law students are feeling and alienation, especially considering I did my undergraduate degree at Windsor and then attended law school as well. Alienation from friends and family, as well as from the rest of the university. Law school tends to be a little bit of a bubble in my personal experience, not kind of being integrated as much in with the rest of the university, attending classes with other faculties. You tend to kind of get stuck in a bit of an echo chamber of people with the same experiences, which can be good in some ways, but can also be harmful when some of the narratives that you're hearing or competitiveness around you is what's going on. It can definitely have a negative impact. There's a very specific idea of success, I think, that's definitely prevalent among law students and some administration, going through things like formal recruits, and even the idea that practice is kind of a necessity at the end of your law school career is something that I've personally struggled with, and it's something that I've heard from other people as well, that assumptions like that and kind of those very specific ideas of where you need to be going can put a lot of stress if that's not necessarily the path that you feel is correct for you. The culture of professional school, I find, is in many ways a little bit different from going through an undergrad or possibly being in the workforce before you start as well. There's much different expectations of you being in a professional school setting, in terms of an understanding that every time that you interact with someone, it's potentially someone who's going to be a colleague in the future or going to have an opinion of you in your career as you move forward. So that's something that I think is definitely a struggle as to having to constantly monitor yourself in a way that you might not have in the past. I pride myself on going to University of Windsor, where we like to talk about access to justice and social justice a whole lot. So mental health and kind of emotional intelligence is something that I have been exposed to in an access to justice context. I think a lot of discussion that goes on around access to justice, in my experience, is more about financial aspects of it. But I've been lucky enough to have professors and mentors who've kind of discussed emotional intelligence and its relevance to access to justice, being able to not only understand what's going on for yourself, but what's going on for other people, and the fact that not everyone fits into the law the way that we would like them to be able to is something that makes us as potential lawyers or someone interacting in the legal field at all, I think is very important to making access to justice available. Even if someone has the financial resources, those emotional barriers can definitely be something that makes the legal process a lot more difficult to go through. So some of the things that I've seen that have, I think, had a positive impact on mental health in the law school that I go to and kind of the profession in general. Discussion, like we're talking about here, and it's mentioned a lot, like making sure that it's not just systematic things in place, but that things like stigma and having conversations about like it being okay to not be okay all the time are really important. Even little things, I'm lucky enough to go to, like I said, to a university where we have like a very supportive community. So small things like having coloring pages in communal areas so that people can kind of wind down, or having big bring your dog to school events where there's a discussion about it's a difficult time during exams or sometimes there's issues, but here, let's go do something fun and it's self-care for a little while. I think those small things do end up having a really big impact and are things that, you know, we can do along the way to make it a lot easier, to make this conversation a lot bigger and more impactful. So that's my spiel for now. I'll pass it off.
Alex?
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to start by speaking a little bit about, in my 3 years at law school, there's a real tension I've noticed between the need to preserve your own wellness and mental health with this illusion that kind of perpetuates law school that everything's fine for everyone. And it's something that I find that especially first years are very susceptible to falling into, where you come into law school, which is this completely new institution, where there's a real new expectation for many people around professionalism and efficacy and making sure that you put your best foot forward. But what people don't often talk about is the fact that there's a real learning curve associated with it, and not everyone understands how to do it right away. And for some people, especially entering first year before you've really built a solid support network, it can really feel like you're the only one that's going through that. And something that really needs to be known for students, and I find that I think it's a real role that second and third years have to tell their first years, and hopefully for those in the profession to tell those who are leaving law school, is that you're not the only one who's struggling. I know personally I kind of fell into that trap a number of times where you feel like you're not cutting it, or you feel like you're not doing the exact steps you're supposed to get to the end goal you want. But there really is no formula for doing well in law school. You have to figure out the strategies that work well for you. And you have to also realize that part of that may involve not just spending every waking hour of your day in the library, but also finding time for the people you know outside of law school, some of the things you used to love outside of law school, or just spending time with those in law school outside of law school. And I think that a huge part of that and perpetuating that kind of a narrative in a culture comes from a combination of the students, but also the administration and those in higher positions of power who are staring at the students from the outside. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's been available for me at Osgoode, what I've kind of come in contact with during my 3 years that I either personally have found helpful or I know others have found helpful. So on the administration side of things, we're very fortunate to have a health and wellness office with several trained counselors who are available for appointments. So that's something that was very new to me coming into Osgoode. It wasn't something I was too familiar with before. And I find it really interesting that you're able to admit that this is a resource that's needed. And aside from that, I know also that the Associate Dean's Office has been working in tandem with the Wellness Office to offer a pilot course around wellness and mindfulness. It's completely optional. It's completely based on participation. There's no grade attached. It's just an opportunity for students to take part in exercises that will promote their wellness and hopefully promote their own sense of well-being and productivity in the process. And beyond this, Osgoode also is very good at providing physical spaces that you can book for private reflection or meditation or what have you for part of your day where you may need a break from the rest of the student body. So I find that the administration has been taking steps over the last few years to really address the needs students have for wellness. And on the student side of things, I find that there's just as many resources, if not more at times, just based on the fact that students bring in their own creativity and bringing forth a lot of these initiatives. At OSGU, we're really fortunate to have a lot of groups that participate in various practice areas and various initiatives. For instance, Yukimi mentioned that I have been involved in the Augsburg Peer Support Center, which focuses on promoting the sense of wellness, whether it be through events or student peer supporters who are available to other students to provide support. And they've also started to connect with the profession and get input from the profession, which I think is a fantastic idea. Outside of that, there are also groups based around more specific forms of wellness that are a little bit more intricate, such as we recently have the Osgood Peer Survivor Support Network, which is based around survivors of sexual assault and sexual abuse, which is a more focused area and requires more training, but it's also definitely a resource that is needed in universities at large at times. And beyond this, also in my role in student government, I see initiatives we've been doing. Our equity officer organizes, or has just launched this week, our Communities in Support of Mental Health Week, where we have a series of events and a series of speakers come in to speak about the issues that face the profession, face students around mental health, to hopefully promote some sense of awareness. I know that personally I've benefited from a lot of these talks. I know that a lot of students have as well. And really the end goal of all of this is a bit of a culture shift, to not so much to change the way we practice as much as being okay with the fact that there is a bit of a learning curve, and these are issues that we face and we need to address at times. And I think if we can start that within campus and within schools, then that can lead to a healthier and hopefully more effective profession.
Thanks, Alex. David?
So I've been to a lot of panels and seen a lot of lawyers speak, but I think this might be the first time I've seen a room full of lawyers listen to 3 law students talk about their experiences. So I just want to say thanks for coming out tonight. I appreciate it. So I guess there's sort of like 2 main things that I'm going to talk about today. Once again, I'm just trying to speak from my own personal experience. They're probably what I'd say is like the 2 biggest mental health challenges I've had to deal with so far in law school, and thinking prospectively about my future legal career, some things I'm kind of alive to as an issue and that maybe I don't have the answers for about how to fix the profession right now, but some directions that I like to see the profession move. So I think it starts out with the thing that you get told time and time again in your first year of law school, that like these are not just students that you're going to be in school with, these are your future colleagues, these are the people you're going to be going through the ranks with. And when I hear that, I think about, well, what do I want out of my future colleagues, these people I'm in the trenches with in a boardroom until 2 in the morning with? I want to be able to reach out to my future colleagues when I'm struggling and to be able to ask for help. I want to feel comfortable disclosing things around them. I want to know that I'm going to be able to count on them, and that more importantly, that they're going to feel that way about me. So I think that in order to create a culture that does that, I need to feel 2 things about the people around me. I need to feel comfortable opening up to them and knowing that they can open up to me, and that I know that they're competent enough to actually have a productive conversation surrounding mental health and help move me forward. So I think that a lot of this comes down to competitiveness and a lack of vulnerability in law school. You show up and everybody is very happy to share their successes in the first week of law school, like what undergrad university they went to. Oh, I have a PhD from Stanford, and I'm sitting there with my undergrad economics degree, and I'm like, oh God, how am I going to fit in here? But like people love these external markers of success. They're incredibly intelligent, driven people who have accomplished a lot and are going to accomplish a lot more. But it can be a very isolating feeling when you show up in week 10, in my case, like week 2, just like, oh my God, I'm behind on readings or something like that. And like, people are very happy to share their successes, but not very quick to share their weaknesses or the times that they're struggling. Everybody wants to put on that happy face and show up and like, oh yeah, it's great. No, it's like the first week of December and I'm freaking out about my crim exam, but I'm just going to say, yeah, oh no, things are going great. I feel great about the crim exam. I'm going to talk about my holiday plans. I think it starts just at a base level about like let's just kind of cut the crap and be able to just say like to a person down the cubicle, just like, yeah, you know what, I'm not doing so great today, and just have a conversation and have it not be weird. And just to be able to sit down and just like interact with each other like as human beings and just be comfortable with where we're coming from. And I think a lot of this like lack of vulnerability is that nobody takes the first step a lot of the times. It can be really difficult in a room full of people where you're going around and people are talking about the exciting projects they're working on to be like, you know what, I didn't really get up to a lot this weekend because I'm really stressed out about school, so I had to take a personal weekend. So I think to strategies moving forward to build this sort of first plane discomfort is just like, look, if you're a lawyer at a firm, be the first one to like be a person to take the first step. Like in front of a class of articling students or summer associates, step out and just be like, hey, yeah, you know what, like I had to take a day off, or like I remember this time, like when I was in your position, I was struggling with this, like whether it doesn't have to be anything profoundly serious. It could be like, I had, a family member pass away when I was working on a big file. That was a really difficult time for me. But you know what? I was able to reach out and talk to the people in my firm and to find supports and to find a way to pull through that. For people like us in our position, seeing a major partner at a law firm just be a comfortable one, just talking about that, acknowledging that is something that gets hard, that people have demands of their personal life, which make it hard to get their job done. But that they were able, within their firm, to come forward and to ask for help and support and rely on the people around them, just is something that I'm looking for personally when I'm looking at a place that I want to begin my legal career. Is like, look, where's somewhere I can feel comfortable reaching out and talking to people. A couple like other sort of institutional reforms is just like all these like team building and orientation events that happen, is sort of getting past the surface level, getting to know your peers, and being a little bit being a little bit vulnerable around people. So I volunteered at the University of Alberta Peer Support Center, student-run counseling service. So somebody would come in and they want to talk about some mental health problem, like maybe it's an exam, maybe they're ideating suicide, maybe they're in an abusive relationship and they're looking to leave it. But we had to know that we could trust our fellow counselors when we were getting burnt out. So one event that we did was we would just sit in a big conference room like this, and everybody would stand against the wall, and they would just read out sentences one by one, and they would sort of progress in their intensity. First sentence would be, sometimes I felt like work was so hard that like I just couldn't make it anymore and I just had to stay home. And if you agreed with the statement, you'd step forward. And it'd get a little bit more progressively intense towards points where people I've thought about, suicide, or I've thought about killing myself sometime, or like, I've attempted suicide, or I've been in an abusive relationship. I have a loved one who's been in an abusive relationship. And like that's pretty heavy, and I don't think we have to jump right to that as the first step. But I think that allowing yourself to exist in a community like that, where you see the people around you making these kinds of disclosures, just shows that you can be vulnerable around the people that you're working with, that you're going to be trying to work forward within the profession. I think that just goes a long way to kind of cutting through this competitiveness and this desire to show that everything's always perfect all the time, and can just help to create a little bit more supportive environment where you feel like you can trust and rely on the people within your profession. From the second plane, competence. Talking about mental health is a very, very difficult thing. I know that before I did my training with the Peer Support Center, if a friend of mine came up to me and was like, David, can I talk to you about something? Yeah, sure, what's up? I'm very stressed out. I'm thinking about killing myself. I don't really know what to do, and I feel like there's no hope and there's nothing left I can do. I had no idea how to handle that conversation. I had no idea what the right thing to say was, what I should do, what I should ask, what I shouldn't say, until I went through 60 hours of training with a registered psychiatrist. I don't think you need to go through that level of training to be able to help that person on the ground. I just finished a 3-hour training at the law school last Friday as part of a peer mentorship program, just to help when somebody is ideating suicide, just resources you can put them in touch with succinctly, and just how to facilitate that so you can help them get the care that they need. I think that knowing that people at a law firm have gone through this kind of training, that you can go down to anybody within your firm, know they attended a 3-hour session, and that they can help connect you with resources in the case that you have these particular kinds of mental health concerns, would be an incredibly important thing and go a long way just to make sure that you could feel like you had that kind of support within the law firm. And then the second thing I like to talk today about is finding balance. So I'm particularly looking at careers in corporate law, so this is something particularly interesting to me in that, as I think the statistics have shown, work-life conflicts, both in the duration of hours and the sort of unpredictability of hours from our articling students and young associate is very concerning. So I think that it comes down to, I think there's some things that I've tried to do on a personal level within law school, and then some more broader institutional things that I think we could see happen. So for a personal level, I think you do really just have to get in touch with your values and your core values about what you want your life to be. Ask yourself at the end of the day, what defines you as a person, your life as a person? Because the legal profession, I found after 1 year of law school, will take up as much of your life as you let it. You have to learn to be the regulator of your own time. In law school, there's always going to be more reason to study, prepping for an assignment, going over it again, studying for a final exam. just like in the, like, you know, there's always going to be more hours to bill. There's no upper bound on the amount of hours that you can bill, and oh my God, everybody's going to love you at your firm if you can kill your billable hour requirement. But then not just like on the work side, but the social side, the pressure to like go to all the social events, the networking opportunities to get involved within the community, because like this profession is very sort of like, you know, socially driven. And that can take up your entire life if you let it. So I found that for me, what was really important was sitting down and saying like, okay, well, what is going to be the part of my life this semester that I'm not going to let law school into, that I'm going to say that I'm going to get this done. This is going to be, you know, my like 1 hour a day or something, or 1 hour a week where I'm just going to carve out that time for me and I'm not going to let anything into it. I appreciate that when you're in law school, it's going to be different. You're not going to have those kind of cyclical demands on your time. But for me, that was just going to the gym, just 1 hour every morning. I got to start my day right every day, no matter how late I was up the previous evening, working on assignments. I'd make sure that I got my time in at the gym. And I think that went a long way just to sort of say for me that like, that I was able to build into my life and build, like, and ask myself, well, what did I value? And just sort of have that kind of internal check on how I was going to spend my time. Because I think that when you're approaching a practice where it's going to be taking up a lot of your time, it's very important just to, I think, get in touch with the core of your life and to sort of set boundaries about like what you are or aren't going to let the profession take up. And I think that looking forward to practice, I'm thinking about more of like not so much this kind of strict rigidity, but a sort of like flexible approach to boundaries. I was really lucky to have an alumni mentor this year who is married, has met his wife prior to attending law school, and is not a lawyer, so is not used to the whole like, oh, we have a closing coming up, sorry, you're not going to see me for 3 weeks. So hearing about how they made that work, where for him, his like wife and his family is the most important thing in his life, and as much as he loves his job, he was very sort of aware that he wasn't going to let that ruin his marriage. And he just told me about times where they'd check in once a month and they would just ask themselves, is this working for us? So for me, looking forward, I think from a personal perspective, it's just thinking about, well, what can I do moving forward with the people in my life, with my partner, with my family, to sort of make sure that like the balance that I'm striking is right for me, and ultimately understanding that like if, you know, exiting the profession at a particular time is just what works for me based on my values, then that might have to be something that I'm going to have to accept. But looking more sort of prospectively and optimistically, I think there are opportunities for institutional reforms. I think there is the push towards flexible work arrangements and the idea of sort of taking personal days a little bit more seriously. Hearing about I'm sorry, I can't remember the author, but the consultancy study is a very, very interesting thing that I hadn't heard about before. But I would say from a sort of management, like it does have to come, I think, from the top down, as much as I'd love it if, you know, the demand for, you know, a 60-hour work week upper bound for first-year associates in Toronto would be fantastic. I don't think students are going to be able to band together to demand this out of some of the larger firms. But I do think from a management level, just sort of looking at, okay, well, when are workers at their most productive? There's a huge amount of empirical data on labor productivity and how it goes down over time. And then trying to look at other types of, you know, ways to bill firms, such as alternative fee arrangements, and a move away from the billable hour as this sort of benchmark of how you determine who's working hard and who isn't. That being said, I think it's like a very exciting time, and yeah, I'm very excited just to sort of see where this discussion goes in the future.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you to all of you. We do want to have the opportunity for the audience here and online to ask questions of the students, especially as it sort of implicates steps forward for both the law society and the profession as a whole. If I can be permitted to ask a question that I'm sort of wondering about coming out of this conversation is something that, you know, I think all of you had spoken very eloquently and very pointedly around the importance of promoting a particular kind of conversation as it pertains to well-being and mental health and practice. And there's another facet to that I'm interested that kind of builds on the sociological research, which is with respect to the professional prestige and social value attached to particular kinds of practice, and what we sort of understand coming out of the research to be the adverse mental health outcomes associated with those types of practice. And I'm wondering what the three of you potentially think are ways that within the legal education environment, a shift can potentially take place which would in some ways make more attractive or offset some of the, you know, the monetary compensation that doesn't necessarily attach to non-large firm types of practice that might encourage more law students to explore these types of practice, you know, given especially what we now sort of understand to be the mental health outcomes attached to these. Does anyone in particular want to address this?
So I think that that's something that, though they try to focus on a little bit at Windsor, there's still that very strong idea that kind of corporate Bay Street law is like the most prestigious thing that you can do. So a lot of people, though that might not be their direct interest, their default is, well, I should be looking to go into this because that's what everyone thinks is the most prestigious. So rather than kind of exploring as many options as they can and perhaps finding something that might not be as high in terms of compensation or prestige, that might be their passion, they kind of fall into like a narrative of that's what is expected of them. I think that there's definitely potential for law schools, both like inside the law school culture and within the administration, to kind of change that. I think an emphasis on experiential learning and projects that I know of personally within my school are things like projects with immigration and refugee work or clinic settings. I think that allows people to experience things and see the rewards that come along with that they may be able to pass along, that may be a consideration that, say, makes prestige less important or can even add a level of kind of complexity to what people are thinking about those sorts of jobs, rather than just considering, oh, well, I'm not going to make as much money as I would in a Bay Street firm. I think that those experiences, having law students experience being in those settings, definitely could help people realize the importance and kind of the prestige that comes along with providing those kind of services that might not necessarily be recognized on like a wider scale in the law school. I also think that having classes in degree programs focused on things like access to justice, or even requirements that maybe not a specific course, but having certain themes be touched upon, kind of does emphasize that certain aspects of law are really important, even if it doesn't fall into that like culture of like large firms or corporate law, because though those are valuable, other things are valuable as well. And I think a lot of students without that direction are very open to kind of overlooking that if they're pointed in a direction of focusing on corporate law. So I think that having kind of things available and even encouraged is definitely important. Having people, as we talked a lot about having like mentors and examples in mental health, I think that having people who work in those professions as well available and kind of as mentors, or say speaking to law students, is also very important, because though they may not be as prestigious as someone who is a partner at a corporate law firm, having someone share their experiences and why they love their job or why it's such important work, I think is something that is definitely valuable for law students moving forward, kind of considering what they'd like to do. And it does add kind of a personal touch to whatever area of law you're considering. And I think that those are all important things when it comes to kind of getting around like the kind of classic ideas of where you should be aiming to go as a lawyer. Because if you want to do corporate law, that's fantastic. And if you don't, you should definitely feel free to explore those opportunities and not feel like it's any kind of a step down to go into like the public sector or any kind of other work. So I think that making sure that people can see the fantastic people that are actually doing that work and the rewards that they may be feeling and why they think that it is a prestigious position that people, if they're interested, should be looking into. I think having those examples and those mentors is important.
Thank you very much. Well, I have lots of other questions for the law students, but I want to turn this over to the other participants here have the opportunity to ask any questions. Running, yeah. I think we need to use the microphones for the webcast folks.
Just to one of your earlier points about the message coming from the top when it comes to law firms, do you see the same thing at the law schools in terms of professors or the dean taking a lead in changes to the curriculum, for example, in a way that, education is still imparted, but perhaps in not such a stressful manner? And I don't just mean sort of providing lip service to these ideas, but I mean actual changes to the curriculum.
I'll take this one. Yes and no. So I think it's still I think that involvement from figures like the dean is definitely something that is going on. I think the integration to the curriculum is still something that's in its very early stages. For instance, the pilot project I mentioned earlier, this optional course that teaches mindfulness and self-wellness practices, is something that in the future could be integrated more. I think it's just a matter of trying to figure out how you mix that with the conventional substantive law that's needed as well for the degree. But I think steps are being taken. I know that, for instance, Osgood's dean and associate dean attended a conference in somewhere in Europe in the summer to discuss strategies, and I hope that it goes beyond this pilot project in this future.
And if I can sort of bring my particular perspective in it as someone who works within the law school environment, I think that there is most certainly the recognition on the part, particularly of administrators, around the need to develop curricular and co-curricular aspects of legal education which are done specifically to address the students' experiences of mental health. You know, at the Faculty of Law at U of T, some of the things that we have done is revamp the 1L curriculum in terms of its implementation so that the first year is now semesterized. I went in the bad old days when I was a U of T law student. My first year, the entirety of my first year of law school rested on 6 100% finals that took place in April. And I think it goes without saying that the adverse mental health impacts of that were fairly significant. So the semesterization was designed to try to address that and address some of the adjustment issues that also some of the law students were referring to. Some of the other steps that they've taken is the shift in the grading system to eliminate the numerical grades that enhanced or contributed to the highly competitive kind of nature and competitive atmosphere amongst law students that, again, the law students have also addressed as something that really detrimentally impacts their mental health. In some faculties, you also see a very sort of thoughtful approach being taken to how to systemically acknowledge the experiences of well-being. Again at U of T, and I'm not promoting the program there, but it's just what I have experience of. We, for the first time last year, developed a mental health strategic plan for the entirety of the law school, which looked at institutional priorities and commitments that we were going to make to health and well-being, and developed out of the 3 key commitments that we made very specific deliverables in terms of programs for law students. And it's, one of the remaining challenges which we do identify, so there's many good things that I think are happening on the educational level, but I think one of the challenges that remains is bringing faculty, so the instructors, into this conversation to expand the range of curricular offerings that are being made. There's a lot that administrators can do and staff like myself can do in terms of the co-curriculars and in terms of programming supports, but my ability and the abilities of other people in my kinds of positions to direct or influence or make suggestions with respect to the curriculum itself is very limited. And I think the faculty that I do engage in these conversations are very receptive, but at this point the conversation from my perspective is happening on perhaps a little bit of a disconnected level, where students and administrators and students and support staff are really engaged in a partnership and trying to make changes, but the faculty haven't been brought into that conversation yet in a way that I think is really going to have to happen for the types of systemic changes that we're all kind of talking about to really be affected and implemented. And as Amanda was speaking earlier about sort of exposure to alternative types of practice, I think if that doesn't happen on the curricular level, we're going to continue to see some of these challenges sort of perpetuated over time. So thank you for that question.
Can I throw something out there too?
Please.
I think another thing that's interesting about, like, in law school specifically, is the dynamic between first-year students and upper-year students. Coming into law school is absolutely terrifying, in case any of you haven't done it. And I think that there's a lot of potential for not only having faculty and administration kind of put things in place, but even having upper-year students they run, at least at my school, a lot of things like social orientation and activities for incoming students, and having upper year students kind of being an example as well. So kind of maybe not having as much control over things like curriculum, but having a little bit more control over the way that kind of social interactions kind of start off in law school can have a really big impact when you're coming into it, I think.
So I've got 2 questions from the webcast, and I'm going to contrast them for you. The first one is, do you think there is a disconnect between our understanding of mental health versus how it is actually addressed in the workplace? How can we as individuals in this profession continue to make the conversation more normalized rather than stigmatized? Here's the contrast. Given the current intense competitive business environment facing law firms, how realistic is it to expect the intense non-mental health friendly attitude within firms to change as desired by the students? Is this the industry for them if they want a different environment? Should they see it for what it is and look elsewhere for the type of environment that they want to work in? Tone mine.
This is an interest, a real pet interest of mine, because it is a narrative that we see happening within the law schools themselves. With faculty, with administrators, and with students. This kind of push and pull between, the segment of the population which, is very sympathetic or empathetic to the experiences of mental health, and saying, listen, like we need. I want to live in a more compassionate society. I want to practice in a more compassionate profession where, we don't need to justify our attention paid to sort of well-being. This is just something we're going to do because it's a value, versus those who sort of, no judgment involved, sort of, take the stance of, no, my values, are with respect to sort of economic security, and professional achievement, and these external markers of success that, David was referring to. And, given that's my value system, it stands in sharp contrast to what it is you're promoting. And I think this is a false dichotomy. And I think this is a really important, narrative that kind of brings together these two camps. Is that, as the research was clearly laid out, it indicates that, if you pay attention to mental health, you get a more effective workforce. So professional achievement doesn't stand in opposition to mental health. Those two things are connected to one another. They enhance one another. And on a very individualized level, I tell this to law students all the time. When we talk about, I'm talking to them about their individual mental health and, the need for self-care, and like, I don't have time to do these things. And I said, that's, to view engaging in self-care as taking away from your capacity to get your schoolwork done is an absolutely false metric. You need to engage in self-care in order to optimize your efficacy. We know about the impacts cognitively of not engaging in self-care, not attending to your mental health, and it impairs your ability to do exactly what it is you want to do academically. And the same thing holds for, the broader kind of landscape around, sort of mental health and the legal profession and its efficacy. So I think as much as these questions do appear to be stark contrasts to one another, I don't think they are. And I think if we can appreciate the relationship between external achievement and caring for ourselves and caring for each other as a profession, I think the differences there kind of, they start to evaporate, and I think we start to establish a little more common ground for working more constructively towards changes in the profession that meet both parties, both groups' needs.
Yeah, can I just chime in on that?
Please.
So, I think it is also important to sort of think about, concretely what we want the sort of, mental health friendly corporate law to look like. I don't think that when I talk about, just, being able to, talk to my peers or a work environment that's more conducive to that, I'm thinking, I want, a 30-hour work week with, coloring books on every table and the puppy room. I'm just can I just have, one day every, 2 weeks that I can count on that, I can go, to a trip out of the city with my partner for the weekend and just know that I don't have to check my phone. I think talking with some of my friends, both in Toronto and New York, who are articling or as life as an early associate, the complaints that I hear the most often are not, I'm working really long hours. They're sort of yeah, I know what I signed up for. It's just I just wish I could just I wasn't completely just at the whims of, the firm, that I had to kind of always be on and always be available. It's to some extent the biggest complaint that I hear is the lack of control and that you have to impose structure on your own life as opposed to just the amount of time that you're spending in the office. And as somebody who's approaching the process, I think that's something I'm kind of acutely aware of. And I don't think that, it's necessarily the most productive way to just sort of move forward in this discussion, to start from opposing poles, this is the way it is and it's not going to change, and no, we want this, radically different, completely torn apart way that the legal profession operates. I'm interested in looking at what kinds of incremental changes we can make, such as the consulting study that was discussed earlier, and just sort of what ways we can sort of work with the firm and talking within the firm's interest about how to get the most out of its associates. And that, for me, I hope is where the discussion heads in the future.
Thank you.
Well, I wasn't sure if I should jump in or not, but as soon as I saw on the advertising it was improving help mental health, I had to be here. I'm a client. and I'm a client who moved into self-representation. And I'm also part of the data study from Professor Julie McFarlane. So I'm really glad to see that Amanda's here and the young students on the panel, because I go out often to speak to the students. I was at Osgoode Hall for Self-Rep Awareness Day. And I think that it's wonderful to focus on the up-and-coming students. And hopefully, with that focus, that will filter out to the more senior members of the community as well. I really appreciate your reference to caring for each other, because you're the legal profession, but there's also us on the other side, the client, the self-rep who is having to go into the courtroom and face counsel on the other side. We have our own huge bundle of mental health issues, stress, anxiety, picking ourselves up on the floor without the support of a community. We don't have peers. We're finding each other, but it's very difficult. So I'm really pleased to hear this discussion about mental health, and I invite you to open that up beyond just the professionals and to the industry at large, including the clients and the collateral effect that you can all have to make a much healthier society, right into the courtroom. Hopefully we don't get there, but many of us, unfortunately, that's the path that we wind up on. So I really appreciate that. And I want to also encourage you to keep in mind there's a heck of a lot more options out there than just the corporate world. We as the self-rep community and the paying client, we want to have alternatives. And there is a whole option out there in unbundled services, flexible work hours for you, where maybe we can't fully retain somebody at a high-priced law firm, but we can certainly, and we need those resources out there that can provide a very flexible alternative to you from a professional perspective. We want it, we're out there, we need it, and you can help alleviate our stress as much as it may help alleviate yours. And the last thing I want to bring out to you is I had been working with a retained lawyer, and initially she was very argumentative and very, the dynamic of the culture of the law community from my perspective. I think she went away and took some courses on active listening and compassion. I really invite everyone in this industry to do that, because it made her life easier, much healthier, and it made my life much easier and healthier, and we had a better relationship for it. So, I mean, I've worked in lots of different areas of law. I feel like I have my own law degree, but I just want to get that out there to you, and I really appreciate you allowing me to come in as a member of the public today to share that, because it is access to justice, so you need to hear from us as well. So thank you for doing that.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for bringing your voice into this conversation, because I think it's absolutely true and incredibly appropriate for this conversation we're having about mental health within the legal profession to be connected to the reason why we all have jobs in the first place, which is serving clients of one form, whether that be corporate clients or whether that be individual people. That is the raison d'etre of the legal profession in many, many ways. So thank you for bringing your voice into this, and I do want to sort of let you know that within the legal education environment, recognition of the experience of clients is becoming more and more part of the conversation. The University of Windsor has been very involved in this research and the development of certain programs with respect to this for a number of years now. And at University of Toronto, we have recently begun a series of workshops to develop the skills amongst law students to engage in what we call trauma-informed lawyering, which is to recognize what the experience of vulnerable client populations undergo and the way it impacts their ability to engage in the legal system, to equip students to more appropriately understand those experiences so they can meet the needs associated with them. And I hope that there are more initiatives and more kind of programs that continue to develop within the legal education context that create a legal profession that is more equipped to do precisely what it is that you're asking it to do. So thank you. Yeah, so another question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, David.
Sorry, I just want to chime in on that. I think that's a really good thing. I just want to bring it back to the peer support center counseling thing I did in my undergraduate degree. Probably one of the most helpful things that I probably could have done before law school, just because to some of what you mentioned, like supportive listening, active listening, being able to support people based on different things and sort of to check some of your own. I just think biases, prejudices, and perspectives at the door is sort of a really important thing. like when I was an undergrad, I had a survivor of sexual assault who was one of my first clients early on. And I think that having gone through the training to have that conversation, like night and day, who I would have been interacting in that environment had I not been through that training. And as I'm looking forward with the diverse range of clients I'm going to be interacting with in the future, hopefully, I just am very happy that I have that because those skills have stayed with me. And I do think that, beyond just like the mental health perspective, just from a sheer like client service perspective, I think that's an incredibly valuable skills for us to have in our toolkit.
Can I throw something out there too before we move on?
Of course, of course.
So, like you said, there's a lot of talk about self-represented litigants at Windsor. Dr. Julie McFarlane is brilliant and is nice enough to do a lot of panels and things and share it with the students. I think it's a really interesting point that you bring up because it's not something that would be talked about an awful lot. We had mentioned before about interaction with kind of colleagues in a firm setting, but I think obviously it's an inherently adversarial system law, the way that a lot of it works, but kind of just interacting with other people, and it doesn't have to necessarily, in a context of lawyer and self-represented litigant, be a let's talk about all of our feelings, but just a respect for the fact that, we're all people, and mental health and like everyone's going through like potentially something difficult when you're encountering that. I think just recognizing that that's the case, and it might not be something that everyone's thought about. I know a lot of the students that I've had discussions about this with wouldn't have even thought to have considered it because they've never been put in that position. So I think just having you come and like kind of throw it into the discussion is super helpful, because just considering those different perspectives is really important, because all of that's relevant to access to justice and mental health.
Thank you very much. I think we have a question over here.
Yes, first of all, I wanted to say how insightful and interesting and engaging you all are, and it's wonderful to see law students. I can't believe how articulate you are, and your understanding of the issues are really show a lot of depth and knowledge, so thank you. My question is actually more about before you went to law school, and did you think about what it means to be a lawyer? Or did you, in your whole, obviously you're thinking about what you want to do with your life, did you think about mental health and had that even come on the radar for you, that lawyers experience mental health and high stress, and was that part of the calculus in making that decision for you?
Yeah, so I think just jump in first. So like I was coming from, I think, maybe like not that unique of a position. So I was in some form of counseling or other for about like 2 to 3 years during my undergraduate degree, mostly related to sort of like social anxiety and sort of professional career related stress. I was like, oh my God, I'm the first one in my family to be in university. What do I do? I, have to make my family proud, but simultaneously I don't want to lose touch with them, some stuff surrounding that. So like I was actually incredibly fortunate because a lot of the things about like emotional intelligence, knowing your values, boundaries, setting limits, these were things that I worked through in therapy for about 2 to 3 years before I even started applying to law school. So at that point I was kind of live to the demands that the profession may potentially place on me in the future. And I guess I was just sort of cognizant that like there are a lot of things that I don't know at this point outside of my control, but I sort of felt that I put in enough work to equip myself with the tools in the toolkit to respond to whatever came at me. And I think one of the like most exciting, best parts about my first year was actually like Yukimi, having somebody within the law school, an embedded counselor who both knows the legal profession and sort of just mental health in general, was incredibly exciting because she was able to bridge that gap where it's like, well, here's the sort of like mental health emotional tools that I have in my toolkit. In what ways can I expect them to be stressed in the profession? And we just talked a lot this year about sort of, how to translate that, how to stay within yourself, know your values, et cetera, approaching law school. So I think that it was definitely something I was alive to prior to attending law school, and it ultimately just fell back on, I thought that I put in a lot of really substantive work during my undergraduate degree to equip myself for the uncertainty I think that law school brings from a mental health perspective.
Yeah, so I would say that it wasn't necessarily a reason I came to law school, although it was something I was hoping, in terms of my own opinions on mental health, that something I could bring to the table once I came here. One of my majors in undergrad was psychology, and so a lot of these issues were top of mind for me over the years before law school. And while I didn't realize coming into law school that the mental health issue was such a prevalent discussion, it was a pleasant surprise when I got here, and I'm very happy to see that it's something that I could open discussion to and be part of, and I'm very happy to see that the professions moving in the direction of at least having the conversations around it?
As I mentioned in my kind of like about myself, I also had some struggles with mental health in high school and my undergrad. So I was very aware when I was even deciding to apply to law school, I was not so sure that it was the right place for me because of the ideas that I had going in, that it wasn't super conducive to having mental health issues and wanting to kind of manage that and possibly even considering it far more important than schooling. So I was a little nervous when I started off at law school. Like I said, I think that it actually wasn't as much of a kind of contrast as I thought it was going to be. But it's definitely something that kind of being aware of it going in was very helpful for me. I have a few friends that I've had discussions with since starting law school who hadn't really considered it as much before starting. And they began to start having some of these issues and were really struggling with whether it was the place for them because they were now starting to experience mental health issues. And I'm happy to just sit and talk to people anytime they want to talk to me. I like to talk. So they got to like hear me kind of rant about it. And like you said, like developing the tools kind of now and moving forward is really important. I think the fact that we're having this discussion when I got to school made me think that this was the right place for me and there was a place for me here. And I think that continuing to have this discussion just is going to encourage other people and encourages me to kind of want to stay in the profession because I know that it's a place that, though maybe everything is not conducive to it right now, we're definitely moving in the right direction. So,
I actually want to follow up on those questions by asking about your experiences coming into this legal culture, right? You all talked about this idea of, being immersed in this culture where working in a big firm, working on corporate files is the most prestigious, where working a lot is prestigious. And I guess my question is, do you think some of us made that shift a long time ago and we've forgotten what it was like. And my question to you is, did you know you were coming into it? And what is it about the first 2 years of law school or coming in how has that become imbued in you? And if it's not what we want, if it's not the message we want to give people, how do we stop that from happening in the first 6 months of law school? Big question, I know.
So I think like the thing that I'd sort of say off the top is it's not about, I think, this is the wrong message we should be giving and we have to undo it. I think it's just sort of moderating it or maybe giving it a little bit more nuance. Like, I loved my first year of law school in a large part because like I got to work very, very hard with a bunch of incredibly intelligent people, probably like one of the most fulfilling years of my life just because it was so academically challenging. One of the things that excites me about the potential practice is just more intelligent people get to work on incredibly interesting and complex issues moving forward. That being said, like all of that subject to, I do not want this to come at the expense of me being okay with myself at the end of the day. I do not want this to come at the expense of the relationships that I think are, fundamental and sort of give life meaning. And I think that that's the message that we have to start sort of talking about in law school is just saying, working hard is a very incredibly noble thing. We pride ourselves on working hard because we're, dedicated advocates who will vociferously work for our clients, et cetera. But just saying that like all of that subject to like there is this baseline that like of mental health and mental well-being that we're not going to let ourselves fall below. So coming into law school, I think that I was aware of that. And that how that was sort of imbued within me was just, once again, I think it comes back to like I was relatively braced for it, and that, when all of this, people started talking about how hard they were working on assignments and the competitive culture of law school just ramps up when everybody's prepping for exams. I was incredibly fortunate because I had that sort of like frame of reference, those tools in my toolkit, as I mentioned earlier, where I was able to sort of take a step back when things got a little bit crazy and sort of say like, okay, like how am I feeling about this right now? Is this me? Is this stretching me too thin? And ultimately, like I met a really fantastic group of people last year who I'm incredibly close with, who were able to be that presence in my life when I wasn't doing it myself. I had friends who, and I'd be working too long on an assignment, they'd send me a message on Facebook and said like, you haven't come out for the last couple of weeks. Like, is everything okay? And I think So it comes from just like, equipping yourself with those tools internally, but then also externally, just like find people who will help be that moderating presence in your life. Because I think there are a lot of incredibly like awesome and wonderful things about law school and, the legal profession as a whole. It's kind of like why I'm here and why I'm excited and trying to help improve the profession. But I think it is just like about giving it that nuance and that little bit of like a moderating factor to it.
I think that everything you said, definitely. And I think that on like a little bit more of a practical like approach to it, just because corporate law has a lot of formal recruits, that's a lot of what you hear as a law student coming in is, this is a nice specified process that we have, so we can hand you a piece of paper about it. Whereas a lot of other areas of practice don't necessarily have that formal recruit. You just kind of have to go out and meet people and talk to people if you're a law student to figure out more about that. So I think just having that potentially available, or if, say, you are someone in a practice area that's maybe not as big or doesn't participate in formal recruits, reaching out to a career services office, being like, if anybody wants to talk about this, I'm available, and like just having people kind of visible to law students. Because I think going in, just because it's a process that kind of is formal and is easy to identify, that's kind of what people grab onto when they're looking for something. So I think not that that's going to completely cure it, but I think simple things like, I know I've said it a couple times, that having people visible and accessible kind of gives people the option of like considering that there is something else other than that.
And kind of expanding on what Amanda said, I think that it's very important to have the other types of options visible. But another thing that hasn't really been discussed here that is a big factor in a lot of people's decisions to go the corporate route is the fact that people enter law school and it's an incredibly expensive undertaking. It's something that people didn't necessarily anticipate being as burdensome as it is. And sometimes being in a big firm seems like the only way to really address the issues around debt that follows. And while prestige is a big part of it, I think that that's something that also needs to be considered. And while I don't know what the answer is in addressing that, especially with the variation in tuition for some law schools versus others, I do think that that's something that needs to be considered. Although I do think that needs to be coupled with the fact that people sometimes aren't aware of the other opportunities that are available or what these opportunities will look like in terms of reward or financial stability a few years down the line once you get past the initial salary that Article 8 students are being paid.
Thank you for raising that issue.
So one more question from the webcast. Do you think that this awareness is a generational change? How can you all carry this culture change forward into the profession?
I'll start on this one. I think there is definitely a generational aspect to it. I think that it's something that people are more willing to discuss now. That doesn't mean that those who are experienced lawyers aren't willing to discuss it, because obviously they are. That's the reason we're here today. But in terms of moving forward, especially with a new generation of future practitioners who are part of a more dominant discussion around this, I think that it's just very important for those leaving law school and entering the profession to remind themselves that this is something that's important, which can be difficult, especially entering areas like articling, where it's easy to get caught up in the demands of meeting billable hours and meeting the demands of the associates and partners who assign you materials, to always remind yourself that this is something that you hold deep and something that's very valuable to you, and something that you should carry forward when you're in a position where you're then assigning work to young lawyers and students.
Statistically, I can speak to the fact that the Mental Health Commission of Canada does track help-seeking behaviors vis-a-vis mental health services amongst different demographic segments of the population, and the greatest increase in access to services is amongst adolescents over the course of the last 10 years. So that speaks to there being this generational shift that people perceive as happening. And I can speak as someone who kind of sits sometimes as a translator between the next generation and those who are more senior in the profession and holding some of the powers. That one of the things that we can ask of those who are in positions of power right now in the profession is not that they necessarily be the agents of change, that they have to. It's not about giving up a measure of prestige or power or accomplishment that they have worked so hard to earn in order to make way for some shifts within the way the practice is going to take place, but more just about being open allowing those who are, in the position of experience, having a different sort of cultural experience, to have their voices heard and some of their opinions and experiences integrated. So the agents of change are sitting here. And what we're asking, I think, from those who hold the power now is to just be open to those voices and allowing those who have these different types of experiences to operationalize some of the insights that they have managed to obtain through the kinds of lived experiences and these sorts of shifts around mental health that has taken place. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
I think you pretty much got it. Well, with that, let me thank all of you. Before I close and thank you, let me just remind everyone this is Access to Justice Week. There are a number of activities planned throughout the week, and if you go to theactiongroup.ca or follow on Twitter at @TagTheActionGroup, you will find various events coming up. Similarly, CIAJ at CIAJ-ICAJ.ca has a number of events coming up, including their 2018 annual conference, if this has whet your appetite, is on justice and mental health in Ottawa from October 17th to 19th, 2018, which will focus in particular on the different ways in which mental health issues are affecting the justice system. So this is an ongoing conversation that ours and other organizations are having. Let me thank you. I think, there's kind of three things I'd like to bring back at the end of today. The first is how useful it is for us to talk to each other from different perspectives, to have sociologists at the front of the Lamont Learning Center and students at the front of the Lamont Learning Center. And I know audiences made up of different people, but lawyers and paralegals in the audience. And I think that the more we in the legal professions remember to talk to listen to other people, I should say, and not talk at and including those who are clients and those who represent themselves, the better, because it's clear that, from the theme of all of this, it all ties in together. That addressing cultural issues in the legal profession affects not only the experience of a student at law school, a first-year associate and associate, but how a lawyer deals with an opposing self-represented party in the courtroom, or by letter, or their client sitting across the desk from them. That these issues, I would suggest, aren't dichotomies between the interests of lawyers or billable hours or success versus prioritizing family, but improving holistically the way we look at the work we do as professionals. Finally, it seems to me that we need to think about tackling these issues on so many different levels, whether it's about how our organizations are put together, how we design our organizations, whether it's about support on the individual level, whether it's about more generally thinking about culture, legal culture, and how we change that culture. And I think we've heard lots of those ideas today, and it's clear that not any one of those things is going to address these issues, but by working collectively, we can improve the way in which we as professionals support each other, have a healthy profession, and also improve how we deliver services to the people, to the citizens of Ontario and Canada, which at the end of the day is why the legal professions exist. Let me thank all of you for the time you put into preparing, for coming and speaking to us and doing it so well without being intimidated in the least. We're delighted to hear your insights, and I urge you not to forget about the insights you have today when you move from being a student to being an articling student to being a lawyer, or whatever you choose to do, whether that's a lawyer or applying your legal skills elsewhere. Because if we remember those things we started with as students in that amount of time, that we'll be able to bring those insights and bring them to what we do as professionals. So thank you all so much, and thank you, Yukimi, for organizing. That concludes our program.